The dull hum of the diner's fluorescent lights blended with the faint clatter of plates and the murmur of tired conversations. Serafina Lowell weaved through the crowded room, balancing a tray of steaming coffee mugs and half-eaten sandwiches. Every shift was long, but it was necessary. Her brother, Elias, was waiting at home in their cramped apartment, relying on her to keep their precarious lives afloat. Rain tapped insistently against the windows, obscuring the city's flickering lights. In the far corner of the diner, a man sat alone, sharply dressed in a tailored suit that contrasted with the worn-out uniforms and casual jackets of the other patrons. He exuded a calm, detached confidence, his gaze fixed on a tablet as he occasionally sipped from a cup of black coffee. Serafina approached with her usual practiced smile. "Can I get you a refill?" The man glanced up, his icy blue eyes scanning her face. "No, thank you," he said simply, his tone polite but distant. As she walked away, she noticed something gleaming on the edge of his booth. A sleek silver card case rested near the corner of the table, half hidden in the shadows. She hesitated, then picked it up. The initials C were engraved in neat, elegant script. Her shift ended an hour later, and the man was long gone. She slipped the card case into her bag, promising herself she'd return it as soon as possible. The following morning, Serafina stood outside the towering Everhart Enterprises building. Its gleaming facade loomed over the busy Baltimore streets, a stark reminder of the gap between her world and that of the man she had met the night before. Inside, the receptionist eyed her skeptically as she explained her reason for being there. Minutes later, Serafina was ushered into an expansive office. Cashin Everhart sat behind a mahogany desk, the Baltimore skyline stretched out in the windows behind him. "You brought this back," he said, holding the card case she had placed on his desk. His tone was neutral, yet there was a note of curiosity. "It didn't feel right to keep it," Serafina replied, clasping her hands to steady them. Cashin leaned back in his chair, studying her. There was no mistaking the surprise in his expression, subtle as it was. Not everyone would have gone to the trouble. His words lingered in her mind as she left the building. Cashin sat in his boardroom that afternoon, enduring yet another debate about the company's faltering public image. The directors were relentless in their calls for a solution, their voices rising with urgency. "You need to show investors that you're more than just numbers," one member said. "You need stability, something personal, family-oriented." Cashin tapped his fingers against the table, his frustration barely contained. He had spent years building his empire, carving out success with unrelenting focus. Now they wanted him to put his personal life on display, a life he had carefully shielded from scrutiny. As the board continued their discussion, his mind wandered. The waitress from the diner resurfaced in his thoughts. Her straightforward honesty, her calm presence. The idea formed before he could dismiss it. 2 days later, Serafina was in her small kitchen, stacking dishes to dry, when there was a knock at the door. Cashin Everhart stood on her threshold, his crisp suit untouched by the rain outside. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice as composed as ever. Minutes later, she sat across from him at the wobbly kitchen table, her arms crossed defensively. "A marriage," she repeated, her disbelief evident. Cashin nodded, unfazed by her reaction. "A 1-year arrangement. In return, I'll pay off your debts, cover your brother's education, and provide financial security for the duration of the contract." Serafina stared at him, searching his face for a hint of humor or insincerity, but found none. "And what do you get out of this?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Credibility," he replied bluntly. "A stable public image. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." Her stomach churned. The offer was outrageous. Yet the practical side of her couldn't ignore the promise of relief from her constant struggles. She thought of Elias, of his dreams of college and a better life. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Then nothing changes," Cashin said simply. "Your life remains as it is now." His calm certainty grated against the storm of emotions brewing within her. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "I'll need time to think about it," she said finally. "You have 48 hours, Cashin replied, standing to leave. As the door closed behind him, Serafina sank into her chair, her thoughts a chaotic mix of fear, hope, and the weight of an impossible decision. Serafina sat stiffly in the plush leather chair across from Cashin Everhart, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to still their trembling. The office, with its sleek lines and muted tones, seemed to echo the man who occupied it. Sharp, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. Cashin leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the edge of his desk. His ice-blue eyes were steady, calculating, as he began to speak. "The terms are simple," he said. His tone was measured, almost clinical. "This arrangement will last 12 months. In that time, you will fulfill the role of my wife in public. Social events, interviews, appearances, you'll attend them as needed." Serafina nodded faintly, her throat tightening as she took in his words. "In return," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "I'll settle all your debts, provide a trust for your brother's education, and ensure you have a monthly stipend. At the end of the year, you'll be free to walk away. No strings attached." She blinked, her mind spinning as she tried to process the enormity of what he was proposing. "And what about us?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There will be no personal obligations," he replied, his tone cool. "This is a professional arrangement, nothing more." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on her. Serafina's fingers curled against her palms, her nails digging into her skin. She thought of Elias, of the stack of bills on their kitchen counter, of the nights she had lain awake wondering how she would make it all work. "Why me?" she asked finally, breaking the tense silence. Cashin regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're honest," he said simply. "You're unconnected to my world, which means you have no hidden agendas." And he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if choosing his next words carefully. "You're believable. People will see you as genuine." She exhaled shakily, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubts and possibilities. It felt as though the room were closing in around her, the air too thick to breathe. "I need time to think," she said, her voice trembling. "Take the time you need," Cashin replied, his tone cool but firm. "But understand this. This offer won't come again." As she left the office, the weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. The choice before her was impossible, yet the stakes were undeniable. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the echoes of the conversation stayed with her long after she walked away. Serafina stepped into the penthouse, her breath catching as she took in her surroundings. The space was vast and open, filled with sleek, modern furniture that seemed more suited to a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the Baltimore skyline, the city lights twinkling like a sea of stars. She tightened her grip on her single suitcase, suddenly hyper-aware of her scuffed shoes against the polished marble floors. "You'll have the guest suite," Cashin said, his voice cool and impersonal as he gestured toward a hallway. "It's fully furnished. Let me know if you need anything else." Serafina nodded, her throat dry as she followed his direction. The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment, complete with a king-size bed and its own bathroom. She set her suitcase down carefully, feeling as though one wrong move might disturb the pristine perfection of the space. Later that evening, Elias's voice crackled over the phone as she called to check in. "You really went through with it?" he asked, his tone sharp with disbelief. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "This is what we need right now, Elias. For you, for your future." "Serafina, this doesn't feel right," he said. "Living with someone like that, it's not you. You don't belong in that world." "I know," she admitted softly, glancing around the room, "but I'll make it work. I promise." The next morning, Serafina met Cashin's assistant, Marian, a poised woman with sharp eyes and an impeccable demeanor. "Mrs. Everhart," Marian said, the title dripping with a subtle edge of doubt as she offered a brief handshake. "If you need anything, I'll be coordinating your schedule." "Thank you," Serafina replied, trying to ignore the weight of Marian's scrutinizing gaze. As Marian walked her through the day's itinerary, Serafina couldn't shake the feeling that the assistant's politeness was a thin veil for something colder. That evening, as Serafina explored the penthouse, she stumbled across an office. The door was slightly ajar, and the glow of a desk lamp spilled into the hall. Curious, she stepped inside. A file lay open on the desk, its contents partially visible. Charts, legal memos, and headlines about a collapsed building tied to Everhart Enterprises. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the documents. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted her. Quickly, she closed the file and stepped away, her heart pounding. Something was wrong here. She just didn't know what yet. The headlines hit faster than Serafina could have imagined. By the time she stepped into the sleek black car waiting outside the penthouse that morning, her face was already plastered across tabloids and online articles. Cashin Everhart's mysterious bride. Who is she? The photos weren't flattering. Grainy shots of her stepping out of the diner, holding a threadbare bag, juxtaposed against Cashin's perfectly tailored image. The headlines ranged from speculative to outright cruel, dissecting her appearance and background with surgical precision. Serafina's phone buzzed incessantly, filled with messages from old acquaintances and strangers alike. Some were supportive, but most questioned her sudden rise from obscurity. She silenced the device, her stomach churning as the car pulled up in front of the Everhart headquarters. Cashin was waiting in his office when she arrived. The blinds were drawn, casting faint shadows across his desk as he leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. "They're relentless," she said, breaking the silence as she entered. "They always are," he replied evenly, setting his phone down. "That's why you need to learn how to handle it." "Handle it?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "They're tearing me apart, and you want me to handle it?" He stood and approached her, his calm demeanor unshaken. This was part of the agreement. You'll be in the public eye now, and how you present yourself matters, for both of us. His words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Cashin gestured toward a chair. "Sit," he said, his tone softening slightly. Reluctantly, she obeyed. "We'll start with the basics," he began. Body language, tone of voice, how to respond to invasive questions without giving too much away. As he spoke, Serafina noticed the subtle shifts in his expression, the flicker of frustration, the slight furrow of his brow when he discussed the media's tactics. Despite his controlled exterior, there was an undercurrent of vulnerability, as though he had spent years building walls that were now beginning to crack. "Why do you care so much about their approval?" she asked suddenly. His jaw tightened. "Because it's the price of staying on top," he said simply, his voice betraying a trace of weariness. By the end of their session, Serafina felt more prepared but no less overwhelmed. As she left his office, the weight of her new reality pressed heavier on her shoulders. Outside, the cameras were waiting, their lenses trained on the woman who had unwittingly become their latest obsession. The gala was a spectacle of opulence. Glittering chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, while the soft hum of conversation mingled with the clink of champagne glasses. Serafina adjusted her dress, the fabric smooth but foreign against her skin. Cashin stood beside her, his demeanor as impenetrable as ever, nodding politely to the endless stream of introductions. "Smile," he murmured under his breath as a prominent investor approached. Serafina forced a small, composed smile, recalling the coaching Cashin had given her. The older man greeted her with a warm handshake, his sharp eyes scanning her with curiosity. "So, you're the woman who's finally tamed Cashin Everhart," he said with a chuckle. Serafina's cheeks burned, but she replied with calm sincerity. "I wouldn't say tamed. He's as sharp as ever." The remark earned a round of laughter, and Cashin's lips twitched in what might have been approval. Throughout the evening, Serafina found herself navigating the room with surprising ease, her honesty and warmth disarming even the most skeptical guests. But the veneer of success shattered when she moved toward the quieter edges of the room to escape the crowd. Hidden in the shadows, two voices carried just loudly enough for her to hear. "I'm telling you, Everhart's hands aren't clean," one man said. "That building collapse? Dozens dead. Someone had to take the fall, and he made sure it wasn't him. Desmond was involved too," the other replied, his voice lower. "But he's gone now. Everhart's the only name left." Serafina froze, her breath caught in her chest. The words sank into her mind, a storm of doubt swirling as she returned to the main room, her earlier confidence now fractured. Later, when the gala had ended and the guests had gone, Serafina confronted Cashin in the back seat of their car. "Why didn't you tell me about the building collapse?" she asked, her voice trembling. Cashin's expression hardened, his usual composure returning like a shield. "It's not your concern. It is if my name is tied to yours," she shot back, her frustration spilling out. "I told you. This is a business arrangement," he said coldly. "Don't dig into things that don't involve you." His dismissal stung, and the silence between them felt heavier than ever. That night, while wandering the penthouse, Serafina found a drawer slightly ajar in Cashin's office. Inside was a letter bearing Desmond Everhart's name, the contents hinting at his connection to the collapsed building. Her heart raced as she stared at the letter. The cracks in Cashin's carefully constructed world were beginning to show. The Everhart Enterprises building was abuzz with tension. Cashin paced the length of his office, his movements sharp and precise. A stack of newspapers sat on his desk, their bold headlines denouncing the company for alleged negligence in the building collapse scandal. "Damage control," Cashin muttered, his jaw tight. "The narrative is spinning out of control." Serafina stood near the door, watching as his composed exterior began to crack. The man who always seemed untouchable was suddenly human, tired, burdened, and perhaps even afraid. "Let me help," she said quietly, stepping forward. Cashin stopped and turned, his expression skeptical. "Help how?" "I've spent years talking people down when they're angry or frustrated," she said, recalling her long nights dealing with upset patrons at the diner. "Sometimes it's not about facts or damage control. It's about making them feel heard." His brow furrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might dismiss her. But then he nodded. "What do you have in mind?" Hours later, Serafina found herself in a conference room, facing a small group of disgruntled reporters. Cashin stood beside her, his presence commanding but silent as she addressed the crowd. "We know mistakes were made," Serafina began, her voice calm and steady. "And we're committed to ensuring that they're not repeated. This isn't about hiding or deflecting. It's about accountability and growth." Her sincerity seemed to diffuse some of the tension in the room. Questions followed, sharp and probing, but she answered each one with patience and honesty. When the reporters left, Cashin turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You handled that well," he said finally. "Years of practice," she replied with a faint smile. For the first time, he returned the gesture. Not the forced, practiced smile he wore at galas, but something genuine. That evening, the penthouse was quiet. Serafina wandered out to the balcony, drawn by the soft glow of the city lights. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of traffic from far below. Cashin joined her a few minutes later, a glass of whiskey in hand. They stood in silence for a while, the tension of the day slowly fading. "I wasn't always like this," he said suddenly, his voice low. She glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "My father was demanding," he continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "He believed weakness was the greatest sin. He used to say that trusting others was a luxury we couldn't afford." "That sounds lonely," she said softly. "It was," he admitted. "And for a long time, I believed him. But lately," he hesitated, his eyes flicking toward her briefly before returning to the skyline. "You make me question that." Serafina's heart stirred at his words. The walls he kept so carefully constructed were beginning to lower, if only slightly. "You don't have to do it alone, Cashin," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You can trust people, some of them anyway." He didn't respond immediately, but his silence felt more contemplative than dismissive. As the city lights shimmered around them, the air between them grew warmer, softer. It wasn't the start of something monumental, but it was a step, a small, hesitant step toward trust. The moon hung high over Baltimore, casting long shadows across the penthouse as Serafina sat at the dining table, papers spread before her. Her fingers traced the lines of text on a printout she had found in the company archives earlier that day. Every word, every number, felt like a piece of an unfinished puzzle. The building collapse that haunted Cashin's reputation had layers she couldn't ignore. Official records painted a picture of negligence, but there were gaps: permits filed late, safety inspections passed despite violations, and curious changes in the chain of responsibility just weeks before the disaster. Her eyes landed on one name repeated in the documents: Desmond Everhart. The name sent a chill down her spine. Cashin rarely spoke of his brother, and the brief mentions she had heard made it clear their relationship was fractured. Still, something about Desmond's connection to the incident didn't sit right. The next morning, Serafina approached Marion in the sleek, glass-walled office space of Everhart Enterprises. The assistant was organizing folders, her movements precise and deliberate. "Marion," Serafina began cautiously, holding one of the documents in her hand, "I wanted to ask about this. Desmond Everhart's role in the company before the collapse." Marion looked up sharply, her expression immediately guarded. "Why are you looking into that?" I've come across some things that don't add up," Serafina said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the nervous edge in her voice. Marion stepped closer, her gaze narrowing. "Let me give you some advice, Mrs. Everhart," she said, her tone low and deliberate. "There are parts of this world you don't belong in, parts that don't concern you. It would be wise to stay out of them." The warning hung heavy in the air. Serafina straightened, meeting Marion's gaze despite the unease creeping into her chest. "I appreciate the advice," she said, her voice firm, "but if this impacts Cashin, it concerns me." Marion's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said quietly before turning and walking away, leaving Serafina alone with more questions than answers. That evening, Serafina returned to the penthouse, her mind racing. She needed answers, and waiting for them to surface on their own wasn't an option. She pulled out the documents again, cross-referencing dates and transactions until something caught her eye: a financial transfer made weeks before the collapse. The recipient was a shell company linked to Desmond. Her heart pounded as the pieces started to fit together. Desmond wasn't just connected to the incident, he may have orchestrated it. As she stared at the evidence, her thoughts turned to Cashin. Could he truly be unaware of his brother's involvement, or was he protecting him? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Her investigation was becoming dangerous, and Marion's warning echoed in her ears. But Serafina knew she couldn't stop now. The shadows surrounding Cashin and Desmond were growing darker, and she was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. The phone call came in the early evening, interrupting the quiet hum of the penthouse. Serafina had been in the kitchen, absently stirring a cup of tea while her thoughts lingered on the puzzle of Desmond Everhart. The shrill ring startled her, and when she answered, her heart dropped. "Miss Lowell? This is St. Mary's Hospital," said the voice on the other end. "Your brother, Elias, has been in an accident. He's stable, but we need you to come immediately." The world tilted for a moment, and the phone nearly slipped from her hand. "I'll be right there," she managed to say, her voice shaking. Cashin appeared in the doorway as she grabbed her coat. "What happened?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with concern. "It's Elias," she replied, her voice trembling. "He's in the hospital. I need to go." Without another word, Cashin picked up his phone and called for his driver. "We'll leave now," he said, already moving toward the door. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Serafina's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, her hands twisting in her lap as she stared out the window. Cashin sat beside her, silent but steady, his presence oddly reassuring. When they arrived, Serafina rushed into the emergency room. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils as she approached the front desk, where a nurse directed her to Elias's room. He lay on the bed, his face pale but alert, a bandage wrapped around his forehead. Relief flooded through her as she took his hand. "What happened?" she asked gently, her voice cracking. Elias winced. "Bike accident," he murmured. "I wasn't paying attention. It's not as bad as it looks." A doctor entered, explaining that Elias had suffered a mild concussion and a fractured wrist but would recover fully with rest and care. "Thank you," Serafina said, her voice thick with emotion. As the doctor left, Serafina turned to see Cashin standing in the doorway. His expression was uncharacteristically soft, and he stepped inside, addressing Elias directly. "You're lucky," he said simply, but there was a faint warmth in his tone. "We'll make sure you have everything you need to recover." Elias blinked in surprise. "Thanks, Mr. Everhart." Cashin's lips curved in a small smile. "Cashin is fine." Later, as Elias drifted off to sleep, Serafina stepped into the hallway with Cashin. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "Family is important to you. That makes it important to me." His words caught her off guard, and for a moment, she saw a glimpse of the man beneath the icy exterior. A man who cared more than he let on. "I didn't expect," she began but stopped herself. "What?" he asked, tilting his head. "I didn't expect you to be this kind," she admitted. Cashin's gaze softened, and he looked as though he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Instead, he simply nodded. As they walked back toward the waiting room, Serafina passed a corridor where two hospital staff members were speaking in hushed tones. "Did you hear about the Everhart mess?" one said. "Yeah. Rumor is, Desmond isn't dead after all," the other replied. Serafina stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. She strained to hear more. "Supposedly, he's been pulling strings behind the scenes," the first voice continued. "Cashin's about to lose everything, and he doesn't even see it coming." The words sent a chill down her spine. Desmond wasn't just connected to the scandal. He was actively working to destroy Cashin. "Serafina?" Cashin's voice jolted her back to reality. He stood a few steps ahead, looking at her with a questioning expression. "Coming," she said quickly, forcing herself to move. As they left the hospital, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief for Elias, gratitude toward Cashin, and a growing sense of dread about the shadow looming over them all. Desmond's name lingered in her thoughts, a reminder that the danger was far from over. The atmosphere in the penthouse was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Serafina sat at the dining table, surrounded by scattered documents and printouts she had painstakingly pieced together over the past week. The pieces of the puzzle now formed a chilling picture. Desmond Everhart, Cashin's estranged brother, was not only alive but actively working to dismantle Cashin's empire from the shadows. Her heart raced as she stared at the evidence. Financial transfers linked to shell companies, leaked documents that tied directly to the building collapse, and cryptic emails traced back to accounts once controlled by Desmond. The implications were staggering. When she heard the elevator doors slide open, her chest tightened. Cashin stepped inside, his coat draped over his arm, his usual composed expression giving way to a faint weariness from the day. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone sharp as he noticed the cluttered table. Serafina stood, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm but tinged with unease. Cashin's eyes narrowed. "About what?" She gestured to the documents. "Desmond. He's alive, Cashin. And he's been working against you all this time." For a moment, the words hung in the air, and Cashin's expression froze. Then, he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "No," Serafina insisted, stepping closer. "I've been looking into the collapse and everything connected to it. These documents, they show payments funneled through companies tied to Desmond. He's behind the rumors, the leaks. All of it." Cashin's jaw tightened as he picked up one of the papers, scanning it quickly. "You've been investigating my family?" "I had to," she replied, her voice rising. "You wouldn't tell me anything. I knew something didn't add up, and now I've found the truth." Cashin slammed the paper down onto the table, his calm demeanor cracking. "You had no right, Serafina." "I had every right," she shot back. "This affects you. And me. Don't you see what he's doing? He's trying to destroy everything you've built." "And you think I wouldn't have figured it out?" he snapped. "You think I need you meddling in things you don't understand?" The accusation stung, and Serafina's chest tightened with frustration. "I wasn't meddling, Cashin. I was helping." His eyes burned with anger, but beneath it, she thought she saw something else. Fear, perhaps, or the pain of betrayal. "You should have come to me," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less firm. "I tried," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But you shut me out every time." Cashin's hand ran through his hair as he turned away, pacing to the window. The lights of the city reflected in the glass, casting faint shadows across his face. "If Desmond is alive," he began, his voice almost a whisper. "Why now? Why come after me now?" Serafina stepped closer, her voice softening. "Maybe he's been waiting for the right moment. The scandal, the pressure. It's all designed to make you vulnerable." Cashin's shoulders tensed, and he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "And you think you have all the answers now? That digging through my life, my family, makes you some kind of savior?" "That's not what this is about," she said, her voice steady despite the sting of his words. "I care about you, Cashin. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." For a moment, the tension between them seemed to shift, as if the weight of their emotions might give way to something deeper. But then Cashin's walls went back up, his face hardening once more. "I can't trust someone who goes behind my back," he said, his tone final. Serafina's heart sank. "I didn't do this to betray you. I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do." "You don't understand my world, Serafina," he said, his voice low. "And you never will." The words felt like a blow, and Serafina's resolve wavered. She stood there, unable to speak as Cashin turned and walked toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. When he disappeared from view, Serafina sank into the chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the documents scattered before her. She had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? The fragile trust they had built was now shattered, and the shadow of Desmond loomed larger than ever. The tension at Everhart Enterprises was palpable. Cashin and Serafina spent days preparing to present their findings to the board, gathering documents and creating a strategy to expose Desmond's schemes. Cashin's usual cool demeanor was fractured, replaced by a steely determination that Serafina found both reassuring and unnerving. "We have everything we need," Serafina said, placing the final folder on the desk in Cashin's office. "Once the board sees this, they'll have no choice but to believe you." Cashin nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "Let's hope they listen before it's too late." But unknown to either of them, forces were already working to derail their efforts. Marion stood in the shadows of an opulent private club, her phone pressed to her ear. Her polished exterior was unchanged, but her expression betrayed the tension beneath. "They're closing in," she said, her voice hushed. "You're supposed to keep them off track," Desmond's voice hissed on the other end. "I've done what I can," Marion replied sharply. "But Serafina's been digging, and now Cashin's fully invested in taking you down." "Then it's time to escalate," Desmond said, his tone cold and final. "Sabotage whatever they've prepared for the board. And remind Cashin that he should have left well enough alone." The day of the board meeting arrived, and the energy in the room was electric. Cashin stood at the head of the table, his commanding presence silencing any preemptive objections from the directors. Serafina sat beside him, her presence a quiet show of solidarity. "This," Cashin began, holding up a folder, "is proof that my brother, Desmond Everhart, has been orchestrating a campaign to undermine this company and frame me for his actions." He outlined the findings clearly and methodically, presenting documents and evidence Serafina had painstakingly uncovered. The board members murmured among themselves, their skepticism giving way to interest. But just as Cashin was about to conclude, Marion entered the room, a folder in her hand and a nervous expression on her face. "Excuse me," she said, cutting through the tension. "There's something I need to add." Cashin's brow furrowed as she handed the folder to the nearest board member. Inside were documents, fake, but convincing, linking Cashin to the shell companies Desmond had been using. The murmurs turned to gasps. "What is this?" one director demanded. "This can't be right," Serafina said, rising to her feet. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Cashin's credibility was now under siege. Back in the penthouse, Cashin paced furiously, his fists clenched at his sides. "She's been working with him all along," he said, his voice a low growl. "I didn't see it either," Serafina said, guilt lacing her words. "I should have noticed something was off with Marion." "It's not your fault," Cashin said, stopping to look at her. "But we can't let this stop us. There are people who can still help." Serafina tilted her head. Who? Cashin hesitated, then reached for his phone. Old allies, people who knew Desmond before he disappeared. If anyone can corroborate our evidence, it's them. Later that evening, Cashin and Serafina sat in a quiet bar on the outskirts of the city. Across the table from them was Alan Whitaker, a former business associate of the Everhart family who had parted ways after a falling out with Desmond years ago. I can't say I'm surprised, Alan said, shaking his head as he looked through the documents Cashin had handed him. Desmond always had a knack for chaos. He couldn't stand that you were the one who took over the company. Will you help us? Cashin asked, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Alan leaned back, considering. I'll testify to what I know, he said finally. But you need more than my word to counter what Desmond's built. Another voice chimed in from the corner of the room. Then you'll have me too. Cashin and Serafina turned to see a woman step out of the shadows. Elena Rourke, a journalist known for exposing high-profile scandals. Desmond burned a lot of bridges, including mine, Elena said, pulling out a recorder. If you've got evidence, I can't help you make it public. But you'd better be ready for the fallout. Cashin nodded. We're ready. As they left the bar, Serafina glanced at Cashin. Do you think this will be enough? It has to be, he said, though there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. But as they drove back to the penthouse, Serafina's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You should have stopped digging. Now you'll see what happens when you cross Desmond. Her blood ran cold as she showed the message to Cashin. He's planning something, she said, her voice trembling. Cashin's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready. But the unease lingered as they both realized that Desmond's final move could be the most devastating yet. The boardroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Every member of the Everhart Enterprises board was present, their expressions a mix of skepticism and curiosity. At the head of the table stood Cashin, his usual commanding presence tinged with an edge of tension. Serafina sat beside him, a folder of documents clutched tightly in her hands. Across the room, Desmond Everhart entered, his movements unhurried, a faint smirk on his face as though he had already won. He took a seat at the far end of the table, his eyes briefly meeting Cashin's before shifting to Serafina. So, Desmond said, leaning back in his chair, I hear you've been busy, little brother. Cashin didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he turned to the board. We're here today to address the accusations against me and the company, and to expose the real culprit behind the sabotage and misinformation that has plagued us. Desmond laughed lightly, crossing his arms. This should be good. Serafina took a deep breath, then stood. Over the past weeks, we've uncovered substantial evidence linking Desmond Everhart to the shell companies used to funnel funds from Everhart Enterprises. These funds were redirected to undermine Cashin's leadership and implicate him in the building collapse scandal. She opened the folder, distributing copies of the evidence to the board members. Here are financial transfers, emails, and witness testimonies that point directly to Desmond's involvement. This wasn't negligence. This was sabotage. The room buzzed with murmurs as the board members pored over the documents. Desmond's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward. Impressive work, he said, his tone mocking. But let's not forget, Serafina, you're married to Cashin. Your so-called evidence could easily be fabricated to protect him. Cashin's fists clenched at his sides, but Serafina spoke before he could. The evidence has been verified by third parties, including a former associate of yours, Victor Malone, and independent financial analysts. Desmond's eyes narrowed. You think this little performance will save you, Cashin? You've always been naive, trusting the wrong people. His gaze shifted back to Serafina, sharp and dangerous. And that will cost you everything. As the tension escalated, Desmond leaned back and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen deliberately. Moments later, Serafina's phone buzzed. She hesitated before checking it, her heart sinking as she read the message. Elias is alone at home, isn't he? Accidents happen. Her head snapped up, meeting Desmond's cold, unflinching gaze. What did you do? She demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Desmond's smirk returned. Just a friendly reminder of how fragile life can be. Cashin slammed his hands onto the table, standing abruptly. Leave him out of this, Desmond. Whatever your grudge is, it's with me, not him. Desmond shrugged. Then stop this charade. Step down, let the company fall apart, and maybe, just maybe, your precious wife's brother will stay safe. The boardroom fell into chaos as voices rose, some demanding order while others questioned Desmond's audacity. Cashin's mind raced, his fury barely contained. But amid the storm, Serafina's voice cut through. You think threats will silence us? She said, standing tall. You're wrong. Her mind worked quickly, remembering the ally they'd recently gained, Elena Rourke. Serafina grabbed her phone and sent a quick message to Elena, detailing the situation and sharing Desmond's latest threat. While she typed, Cashin addressed the board, his voice steady but filled with urgency. This is the kind of man Desmond is, willing to endanger innocent lives to serve his own interests. Do you want him anywhere near this company? Minutes later, Elena arrived, storming into the boardroom with a cameraman in tow. The sudden appearance stunned the room into silence. What is this? Desmond snarled, rising from his seat. Elena Rourke, investigative journalist. Elena said, her tone sharp. And I have everything I need to expose your schemes, Desmond. Every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated account. And now, thanks to your little stunt today, a live-recorded threat against an innocent teenager. The cameraman's lens focused on Desmond, whose composure began to crack. This is a private meeting, he barked. Not anymore, Elena retorted. The world deserves to see the truth. Desmond's face twisted with rage as he realized the walls were closing in. You think you've won? He sneered, pointing at Cashin. This company will fall apart without me. Cashin stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. This company will thrive without you. It always has. Desmond lunged for the cameraman, but security, already alerted by Cashin, intervened, dragging him back. As Desmond was escorted out, he locked eyes with Serafina one last time. This isn't over, he spat. Maybe not, she said, her voice steady. But you are. The board meeting adjourned in a stunned silence, with many members expressing their support for Cashin's leadership. Back at the penthouse, Cashin and Serafina sat in the living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Thank you, Cashin said quietly, his gaze fixed on her. For what? She asked, exhausted but relieved. For standing by me, he said. For believing in me when I couldn't see a way forward. Serafina smiled faintly. We're a team now, remember? For the first time in a long while, Cashin let his walls down completely, taking her hand in his. I don't deserve you, Serafina, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that I do. Their bond, forged in the fires of betrayal and resilience, was stronger than ever. But they both knew the battle wasn't truly over. Desmond's final move still lingered on the horizon, a shadow waiting to strike. The tension in the air was palpable as Cashin sat at his desk, staring at the documents spread before him. The fallout from Desmond's exposure was far from over. While the immediate threat had been neutralized with Desmond's removal, the media frenzy surrounding the scandal threatened to destabilize Everhart Enterprises entirely. Serafina entered the room quietly, a cup of coffee in hand. She set it on the desk and stood by his side, sensing the weight of his thoughts. They'll understand, she said softly. Cashin exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. Will they? I've spent my entire career cultivating an image of control and strength. Now, I'm about to stand in front of the world and admit that my family nearly destroyed everything. Sometimes showing vulnerability is the greatest strength, she replied. Cashin met her gaze, her words striking a chord he didn't want to admit was true. The press conference the next day was a media spectacle. Cameras flashed incessantly as Cashin approached the podium, flanked by his legal team. Serafina stood off to the side, watching as he took a deep breath and began to speak. Today, I'm here to address the allegations that have surrounded Everhart Enterprises in recent weeks, he began, his voice steady but resolute. While this company has always operated with integrity, mistakes were made by people who sought to exploit our name and resources for their own gain. He paused, glancing briefly at Serafina, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. I take full responsibility for the actions of my family, including my brother, Desmond Everhart, who orchestrated much of the damage we've faced. But I also stand here to reaffirm my commitment to transparency and accountability. As he continued, Serafina noticed something different in his tone. Raw honesty that wasn't there before. This wasn't the polished, unyielding Cashin Everhart she had first met. This was a man willing to lay himself bare to protect the people he cared about and the legacy he had built. The next hurdle came with the authorities. The evidence against Desmond was strong, but without first-hand testimony, securing his conviction would be a challenge. That was when Serafina made her decision. "I'll testify," she told Cashin later that evening. He looked up from his desk, startled. "What?" "I'm the one who found the evidence, who spoke to Malone, and who saw the threats Desmond made," she said firmly. "If the prosecution needs someone to tie it all together, that person is me." "No," Cashin said immediately, standing and crossing the room to face her. "You've already done enough. I won't let you put yourself in the crosshairs. This isn't just about you, Cashin," she countered. "It's about Elias, the company, and everyone else who could be hurt if Desmond finds a way to escape justice." Cashin's expression softened, the conflict in his eyes clear. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low. "Yes, I do," she replied, reaching for his hand. "Because this matters. And because I believe in you." The day of the trial arrived, and Serafina took the stand. She recounted everything, how she had discovered Desmond's involvement, the threats he had made, and the lengths he went to in order to sabotage Cashin. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, her voice unwavering despite the weight of the moment. When she finished, she glanced at Cashin, who sat in the gallery, his expression unreadable but his gaze unwaveringly fixed on her. The testimony proved to be the turning point. With Serafina's evidence and witness statement, the prosecution dismantled Desmond's defense piece by piece. By the end of the trial, Desmond's conviction was all but assured. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, the atmosphere was quieter. The trial was over, but the emotional toll of the past weeks lingered. Cashin found Serafina on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. He stepped beside her, leaning on the railing. "You were incredible today," he said softly. "I was just doing what needed to be done," she replied. "No," he said, turning to face her. "You did more than that. You stood up for me, for Elias, for everything I care about. And you didn't have to." Serafina met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Of course I did. I couldn't just stand by and let him win." Cashin reached for her hand, his touch gentle but deliberate. "I've spent so much of my life keeping people at a distance, thinking I didn't need anyone. But you," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "You've changed everything." Her breath caught as his fingers tightened around hers. "I don't want this to end," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "Not the contract, not us. I don't care what anyone thinks. I care about you." Tears welled in Serafina's eyes, but she smiled, the weight of the past weeks lifting in an instant. "I care about you too," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. For the first time, there were no barriers between them, no pretense, no distance. Just two people who had weathered the storm together and emerged stronger. As the city lights shimmered around them, Cashin pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they both felt whole. The headlines about Desmond's arrest and the trial's conclusion faded from the news cycle in the following weeks. In their place, articles began to focus on Everhart Enterprises' recovery under Cashin's leadership. While the damage had been significant, Cashin wasted no time steering the company toward a path of accountability and integrity, qualities he had once regarded as secondary to power and control. Serafina watched from a distance as he navigated the company's transformation, her admiration for him growing with every step he took toward creating something better. One sunny morning, Cashin stood in the middle of a conference room filled with his senior team. The atmosphere was different now, less rigid, more collaborative. "We're restructuring key divisions to ensure transparency," he announced. "No more hidden deals or opaque contracts. If we want to rebuild trust, we start from the ground up." As the team absorbed his words, he caught sight of Marion's empty chair. Her betrayal still stung, but it served as a reminder of how complacency had allowed cracks to form in his organization. He wouldn't make that mistake again. After the meeting, Cashin returned to his office, where Serafina was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. "How did it go?" she asked, handing him one of the mugs. He leaned against his desk, taking a sip. "Better than expected. They're starting to see the bigger picture." She smiled. "That's because you're giving them something worth believing in." He set the mug down, studying her. "You're a big part of that, you know? You've made me see things differently. Made me want to be better." Serafina's cheeks flushed, but she didn't shy away from his gaze. "You're doing all the work, Cashin. I'm just here to cheer you on." Back at her modest apartment, Serafina settled into a quieter routine with Elias. He was healing well, both physically and emotionally, and their life had regained a sense of normalcy. Yet, the changes in her were undeniable. She found herself reflecting on her time with Cashin, the challenges they had faced together, the moments that had tested and strengthened them. Though their worlds had once seemed miles apart, they had bridged that gap through trust and resilience. One evening, Cashin appeared at her door unannounced, a rare hint of uncertainty in his expression. "I know this isn't my usual environment," he said, glancing around the cozy apartment, "but I wanted to see you, to see where you feel at home." Serafina chuckled. "Well, here it is. Nothing fancy, but it works for us." As they sat on the couch, Elias joined them, tentatively at first. But soon, they were laughing over old stories, sharing a meal, and enjoying a simplicity that had once felt out of reach. Cashin didn't leave right away. Instead, he lingered, helping Serafina with the dishes as Elias headed to bed. "This is nice," he said, his voice soft. "What is?" she asked, glancing at him. "Being here. With you." "With Elias." He paused, setting down the dish towel. "I've spent so much of my life chasing the next deal, the next goal. But this feels real." Serafina turned to face him, her heart swelling. "That's because it is, Cashin." As the days turned into weeks, Cashin made a point of weaving himself into Serafina and Elias's lives, not as the powerful CEO, but as a man who cared deeply for both of them. He attended Elias's school events, helped Serafina with household repairs, and even learned to cook a few basic meals under her patient guidance. At the same time, Serafina found herself stepping into his world more confidently. She accompanied him to corporate events, not as a figurehead but as someone whose voice mattered, a partner in every sense of the word. One afternoon, Cashin called a company-wide meeting, announcing a new initiative aimed at supporting communities affected by the past scandals. "We can't erase the mistakes of the past," he said, his voice clear and resolute, "but we can take responsibility for them. This company will prioritize transparency, integrity, and giving back to the people we've let down." The announcement was met with applause, and later that evening, Serafina found him on the balcony of the penthouse, staring out at the city lights. "You did it," she said, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "We did it," he corrected, turning to face her. "None of this would have happened without you." Their bond, once fragile and uncertain, had grown into something unshakable. As their lives intertwined further, Cashin began to see the future differently. It was no longer about the empire he had built, but about the life he wanted to build with Serafina and Elias. And for the first time in years, the prospect of that future filled him with hope. The sun dipped low, casting the penthouse in hues of amber and gold as Serafina stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of marinara sauce. The savory aroma filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of Elias flipping through his notebook at the kitchen counter. The cozy scene contrasted sharply with the penthouse's usual sleek and minimalist aura, a testament to the changes that had taken root in this once sterile space. Cashin entered quietly, pausing at the threshold. For a moment, he simply observed Serafina's focus as she stirred, her soft smile when Elias asked a question, and the faint warmth in the air that felt utterly foreign and entirely welcome. "You're just in time," Serafina said, glancing over her shoulder at him, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Elias is convinced he's going to starve." "I'm serious," Elias chimed in, grinning as he looked up. "She's making me wait an eternity." Cashin chuckled, moving further into the kitchen. Then I'd better stay out of your way before things get critical. He leaned down slightly, catching the aroma of the sauce. Smells incredible. It'll taste even better if you set the table, she teased, nudging him lightly with her elbow. He raised an eyebrow but complied, grabbing the neatly folded napkins from the counter. When they finally sat down to dinner, the atmosphere was relaxed and filled with laughter. The once formal dining table was now adorned with mismatched plates, a bowl of salad slightly out of place, and a pitcher of water surrounded by condensation rings. Elias regaled them with stories from his day at school, his animated voice filling the space with life. Serafina listened intently, offering her insights and encouragement. Cashin chimed in occasionally, his usually reserved demeanor softening as he allowed himself to relax into the moment. As dinner came to an end, Elias stood and grabbed his plate. "I'm going to finish my project before it gets too late," he said, glancing at Serafina. "Thanks for dinner. It was amazing as usual." "You're welcome," she said, smiling warmly. "Don't forget to actually clean your room afterward." Elias groaned but grinned as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Cashin and Serafina alone in the softly lit dining room. Cashin leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on her. "You've changed this place," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of awe. "What do you mean?" she asked, tilting her head. "When we first started this arrangement," he said, his tone softening, "this place was just a building. A beautiful one, sure, but empty. Now it feels alive, like a home." Serafina's heart swelled at his words, but she kept her tone light. "Well, a little laughter and a lot of sauce can work wonders." He chuckled, but then his expression turned serious. "It's more than that. It's you." Her breath caught as she met his gaze, the intensity of his expression leaving no room for doubt. Later, they found themselves on the balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before them. The air was cool, and Serafina leaned against the railing, her arms resting lightly on the edge. Cashin stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but his gaze contemplative. "You know," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "when this all started, I told myself it was just a business deal, that I could compartmentalize everything. And now?" she asked, her voice soft, almost afraid of the answer. "Now I realize how wrong I was," he said, turning to face her fully. "This isn't about a contract anymore. It hasn't been for a long time." Her hazel eyes searched his face, and for once, his carefully guarded mask was gone. He was just a man, vulnerable, hopeful, and utterly sincere. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "A reason to want more than the next deal or the next win. You and Elias, you're my family." Tears welled in Serafina's eyes, her heart overwhelmed. "Cashin," she began, her voice trembling, "I never expected this, but you've become my family too. You've been there for me and Elias in ways I never thought possible." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. "I want this to be real," he said simply, "not because of an agreement, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." A tear slipped down her cheek as she smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "It already is real." Inside, Elias had sprawled on the couch with his laptop, his project forgotten as he flipped through channels. Cashin and Serafina joined him, Cashin pulling her close as they sank into the cushions. "Movie night?" Elias asked, glancing at them with a grin. "Why not?" Cashin replied, reaching for a bowl of popcorn on the coffee table. As the movie began to play, the room filled with laughter and the soft rustling of snacks. Serafina glanced around, her heart full as she realized how far they had come, from a fractured arrangement to something unshakably real. Cashin's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining in a quiet gesture of unity. For the first time, the penthouse felt like more than a symbol of wealth or power. It was a home, a place where love, trust, and resilience had taken root, and where their future stretched out before them, as warm and infinite as the city lights below.